For me, the Tak franchise has been all style and not a lot of substance so far. I love the idea of Tak, and the art style, designs, and overall feel of the franchise really strike a chord with me, but when it comes time to play the games, well, that's a whole different story. Apart from Tak and the Power of Juju on GBA, I haven't truly loved any games in the series. The two console games have been middling, and the less said about Staff of Dreams on GBA, the better. The first two home console games had plenty of things that I loved, but it felt like the developers kept shooting themselves in the foot every time they almost found the right formula for the gameplay. With this third entry into the series, Tak is basically coming to its demise. After this game, Avalanche Studios would be whisked off into a completely new direction, and while Nick tried to revitalize the games to promote the eventual animated series, Guardians of Gross and Mojo Mistake are not nearly as beloved as the original three games. With one final shot at a Tak game, will the Great Juju challenge finally deliver what I've been looking for? My name's Brandon and this is Nickelodeon Video Game History, a show where I look back on Nickelodeon's 30 years in the video game space and retrospectively review each entry chronologically. From October 15, 2003 to September 19, 2005, all three of the original Tak games would release. It really was a blink and you'll miss it time in the sun for the franchise. Tak had already established itself as a big part of Nickelodeon's video game history, purely based on its origins. Nickelodeon had never before created a video game for a series that didn't even have a show or movie in existence yet, but it's also extra notable for being Nick's first ever Nintendo DS game. Almost a year after the dual screen revolution had hit shelves, it was time for Nickelodeon to make the jump. This didn't mean Nickelodeon would be abandoning the GBA though, far from it in fact. Nick would put out GBA games well into 2007, even going as far as to release a number of exclusives for it. Way Forward, most famous for Shantae on the Game Boy Color, was no stranger to Nintendo's handhelds or Nickelodeon either. Most recently, they'd made the SpongeBob movie game on GBA, with the GBA version of Lights Camera Pants coming exactly 1 month after this game was released. Ultron would jump onto the Nintendo DS version, marking the very first time they'd work on that platform, but far from the last, seeing as they'd make 5 more Nickelodeon DS games, including Mojo Mistake. They'd also released Danny Phantom the Ultimate Enemy in the exact same month as the Great Juju challenge, which was a terrible release from an otherwise pretty reliable developer. On the home console side of things, well, it's no surprise that Avalanche Studios returned for the final game of the trilogy. Tak was their baby. Since releasing Rugrats Royal Ransom in 2002, Avalanche had been mostly focused on working in partnership with Nick, but it was right around the time of this game's development that they started branching out again and would undergo a significant change that undoubtedly completely altered the future of the Tak franchise. In March of 2005 they released Dragon Ball Z Sagas, and then in October they released Chicken Little. Including the Great Juju challenge, that's 3 home console games in a single year, and if you include the release of Tak 2, they basically put out 4 games in a 12-month period. If you extend it out to January of 2006, they'd release 5 games in roughly 15 months. From what I can find, Avalanche had around 115 employees at this point in time, broken up into 3.5 teams. These guys must have been under some insane crunch, but that unbelievable work ethic without a doubt paid off, because on April 21, 2005, the House of Mouse burst through the door and paid $50 million for the studio. That's right, Disney completely snatched them up in the middle of production on the Great Juju challenge. This is the reason why we never saw them make another Tak game, and I think it's probably why the series immediately declined. The fathers of Tak were gone and the passion for the series just wasn't there anymore. Naturally, after being purchased, they focused solely on Disney properties, until Disney cut them loose in 2016 and they were snapped up by Warner Brothers, where they're now making Hogwarts Legacy. But things are looking pretty shaky at Warner Brothers right now, so who knows, maybe there's an outside chance more tack could actually happen one day. Critically, the Great Juju challenge runs the gambit of scores. On the bottom end, you've got the GBA release, sputtering along to a pathetic 5.2, which, believe it or not, is better than Tak 2, which received a 4.5 average. At this point, I sound like a complete liar mentioning that the first Tak GBA game received a 7.9. Unbelievable. The DS game fell in the middle, settling at a 6.6, which doesn't seem too bad. And of course, the home console version was king, landing at a 7.5, actually putting it slightly above the first two games. But before we get to that, we're going to have to check out the GBA version and see if it's really as bad as critics thought it was back in 2005. I try to give every game I play on this channel a fair shot to impress me. Sometimes games have very rough starts, but they find their footing 2 or 3 levels in. Heck, Staff of Dreams on GBA was one of those games that significantly improved after its opening. It never became good or anything, but it was much better than the opening levels had me believe. The Great Juju challenge is not one of those games. I knew I hated this game before the end of the first level, and the following levels did nothing but reinforce that feeling. It's got uninspired gameplay, dodgy controls, and some really baffling level design and mechanics. It's a recipe for making you want to flush the cartridge down the toilet. After their mediocre SpongeBob movie game, which shares the same engine and some mechanics as this game, WayForward really hasn't impressed me. Essentially, the tandem character gameplay from the SpongeBob movie returns here, but this time you can actually switch to that second character, rather than just utilizing them for a special move or two. Naturally, each character has their own set of abilities. When it comes to combat, Tak is a ranged attacker, while Locke relies on his muscle. Locke is by far the most enjoyable of the two characters, largely due to a lot of his abilities being tied to dashing through the air, which can be quite satisfying to use. But you can't go too wild with these abilities because, like every other Tak entry, they're tied to a mana meter. Your mana bar automatically fills over time, which is convenient, but you can also pick up these blue potions to fill it quicker. If your mana bar is all filled up, picking up a blue potion will cause another counter to tick up. Reaching the target number here upgrades the amount of mana you have available to use. I think this is a cool way to implement an upgrade system, but the fact that your mana bar is constantly refilling sort of made this redundant. You have so much mana to start off with that I can't say I often found myself wishing I had more. It's also never explained to the player. Initially, you'll probably be confused why you're not making progress towards that upgrade before you finally put 2 and 2 together. The system is also used for Tak and Locke's health, which works so much better because your health doesn't automatically refill. You're constantly taking damage here, so the upgrade system feels like it actually rewards you for playing the game well. The tried and tested formula of making certain parts of levels only traversable via a specific character pops up here, with less than stellar results. The best example is Locke's dash ability, which is constantly required to clear large gaps, but the spacing of these is just so messed up. When the tutorial jump is requiring the player to be almost pixel perfect, it's probably time to go back to the drawing board and make the gaps a little shorter. It also doesn't help that Locke's abilities have a habit of being activated at the most inconvenient times. WayForward ties almost all of Locke's powers to double tapping the D-pad. In a platformer where it's extremely common to be rapidly pressing the D-pad to do things like, get out of the way of enemies or course correct on a poor jump, you'll constantly be activating a power without meaning to. Overall, the basic moment-to-moment gameplay is extremely dull. Combat boils down to standing in front of an enemy and spamming the attack button. Every enemy needs at least a few hits to take down, meaning the pacing is ridiculously stilted. It's hard to get an actual flow going here when every few seconds you have to come to a complete stop and start thwacking an enemy before moving on. Then you'll get some sort of uninspired puzzle where you have to use a specific power or use a sheep as a launch pad. Tak will get access to his chicken suit and Locke gets a brand new lobster suit, but these don't really change anything. Instead, it's basically the same thing you've been doing, but in the air or underwater. The game I've been describing so far is just sounding sort of mediocre. It's all of the little things here that really wear you down and make this game such a bad experience. There are bonus levels that you will accidentally stumble into and have no fucking clue what's happening. You just sort of fiddle around and hope to God you figure out what the objective is supposed to be. And then upon completing the bonus level, things get even more confusing as you're given a Juju race blessing. I couldn't even begin to tell you what a Juju race blessing is, because the game just drops that on you and then delivers no follow-up information. It didn't seem to change a single thing about the game as far as I could tell. After completing the first one of these and not noticing any sort of reward, I just ignored them. Why should I put effort into doing these extra sections if it doesn't benefit me? Great Juju Challenge on GBA is broken up into different worlds via an overworld section. You quickly discover that each world has a distinct structure to adhere to. You start off with some platforming levels, square off against a Juju in what is sometimes a boss battle, but it could also be a memory puzzle, and then you finish it off with a race. No, not some sort of timed platforming race, it's a kart race. I knew beforehand that the home console version of this game was structured like a race, but I had no idea that Tak would be jumping into a vehicle and zooming around a track. It's so bizarre and feels ridiculously out of place because the other gameplay sections don't have this race vibe. The story mentions that you're competing in the Great Juju Challenge, but this isn't emphasized throughout the platforming levels. So when you come to your first kart race, it completely throws you off. Even more so when you start the race and see that it plays worse than Nicktoons racing on the Game Boy Color. These races go at 1,000,000 miles per hour, and with the way the screen is positioned, you really don't have any time whatsoever to react to what's ahead of you. On top of that, there's just no skill involved here. You have Mario Kart style power-ups, but unlike a normal kart racer which determines the chance of what power-up you'll receive, depending on your current position, here it's just a free-for-all. Some of the power-ups are absolutely broken, like the one that completely freezes all other races for a lengthy period of time. Depending on the game's RNG, you could either get out to a lead and get great power-ups that let you win in laughably easy fashion, or you could get fucked over hilariously by the AI and come last. Not once did it feel like I was in control of whether I progressed past these sections. While these always felt unfair, the karting sections weren't what forced me to switch the game off for good. In fact, the karting almost strays into so bad it's good territory based on how absurd and out of place it feels. Instead, it was one of the regular platforming levels that was the nail in the coffin for me. In the third world, you come across a level where water is rising and dropping constantly. A pretty normal mechanic as far as platformers go, a little annoying, sure, but nothing worth quitting a game over. That's what I thought until I experienced how poorly implemented this hazard is in the Great Juju Challenge. You basically cannot touch the water at all if you want to live here. At first, I thought I was dying in such small portions of water because of the height difference between Tak and Locke. I was controlling Locke here, who is significantly taller than Tak, so I just assumed that Tak was drowning while Locke seemed fine, which was resulting in my death. But no, as you can see, there were plenty of times where Tak and Locke were dying because water touched their knees. How did this get past QA? It's quite frankly embarrassing. It was at this point I had to walk away from the game for good for my own sanity. Visually, the game is kinda lackluster. Tak and Locke don't look great, and Locke in particular looks goofy as hell. The previously mentioned height difference between the two is also distracting. Yeah, Locke is supposed to be taller than Tak, but it feels like he's twice the size here. I will give them credit for how distinct each world feels though. Each level is so visually unique, which had been a bit of a problem with some previous Tak games, feeling like they were an endless onslaught of just green jungle levels. I really didn't enjoy a single second of Great Juju Challenge on GBA. It's easily the worst in the GBA trilogy. Basically every aspect of this game is poorly designed or implemented. The core gameplay loop is dull as dishwater, and when they sprinkle in sections that make you want to pull your hair out, like the rising water, you quickly question how much longer you want to play for. I truly can't believe how far the quality of this series fell. The first GBA game is genuinely incredible, and one of my favourite games in Nick history. This game, on the other hand, is something I hope I never have to think about ever again once this video is released. For the love of all Juju, I hope Altron put together something much better on the DS. Tak and the Power of Juju on the Nintendo DS is a game that is massively held back by the developer being sucked in by the console's gimmicks. This obsession with exploring every possible use of the DS's touchscreen caused me to have such a whiplash playing the first hour or so of the game. I'd swing from hating the game to loving the game from moment to moment. It's honestly one of the more bizarre gaming experiences I've ever had. You start off in what is basically a low-res version of the home console games, with a very quick tutorial taking you through combat, platforming, and some basic powers of Tak and Lock. But then you're immediately shunted into kart racing. Similar to the GBA, this game's levels are designed with a specific structure, albeit not quite as rigid as the platforming, boss battle, race repetition of that version. You start every section of the game with a kart race, then you move on to a more traditional 3D platformer level. The introduction of vehicle racing to the series still had me a little shocked, and I'll touch on that a little bit more later. What I was most baffled and enraged by was the first level in what is supposed to be the traditional Tak gameplay. Inside of this first platforming level, you quickly get introduced to this game's third style of gameplay, mini-games. The first level's pacing is ridiculous with these. You're legitimately stopping what feels like every 30 seconds to play a new minigame. In this opening level, the Great Juju Challenge might as well be a shovelware minigame collection. But once you power through that, play the second kart racing level, and get to the second platforming section, the game sort of just drops the minigames almost in their entirety. Seriously, they just drop the minigames for the most part in the second level. I think I played one, maybe two here. I've got no idea why they spammed so many minigames in the first level, and then followed it up with what is a pretty traditional Tak level. It's such a weird design decision. I went from absolutely hating this game to being in love with it all in the span of 2 levels, but to get to the joy that is the game's traditional style levels, you still have to burn some rubber. Still clueless as to why anybody involved with any of these versions of the Great Juju Challenge thought car racing was a cool thing to add to the Tak series. It's clearly come from the team at Avalanche, and I'm dreading their version even though it'll probably be the best of the bunch. Unlike on the GBA, this is just straight up racing. No power-ups, no wackiness whatsoever like Mario Kart. Just pure racing from point A to point B. WayForward missed the mark with their power-ups, but to see Altron go the complete opposite way is just as frustrating. A boring traditional race isn't what I'd expect or want from this series. Making these segments so much worse is how stiff the handling is. Your car feels like it weighs 50,000 tons, and you'll be jamming your finger down on the D-pad so hard to get that son of a bitch around corners. Compounding this issue is that each track has bottomless pits that you can accidentally zoom off into. In basically every kart racer ever, this just causes you to incur a minor penalty while you're reset back on the track. In Tak the Great Juju Challenge, it forces you to start the whole race over. Visually, it can sometimes be really tough to actually tell what's up ahead on the track, causing me to confidently fly off into a bottomless pit a number of times when I was unfamiliar with a new track. All of these factors combine to make one of the most unsatisfying and unforgiving races ever. On top of that, it really feels like the developers are deliberately holding the player back in their initial couple of races. The speed and acceleration of your vehicle is so poor that once you mess up and drop down a position, it's rare that you'll ever make up that ground. And what makes me think this is on purpose is the fact that you don't need to win these races, you just need to do well enough to come at least second last. The poor performance of your vehicle is in place to allow you to upgrade it in future races. On your journey, you purchase blessing gems, and there's a whole segment of these dedicated to your vehicle's handling and speed. Applying these does make a notable difference. It never feels amazing to drive, but certainly a whole lot better than the way it controls in the first race. In my opinion, upgrading your vehicle should be your first priority in this game to save you a lot of frustration. Once you plow through these out of place feeling races, you find yourself dropped into levels that would feel right at home on the PS2. These are all about platforming, combat, and puzzle solving, but they're a little bit retro as you're using a D-pad to control movement through a 3D space. But surprisingly, movement feels quite nice in this game. I'd go as far to say it's a step above some of the PS1's most notable 3D platformers. And that's a relief because there is a whole lot of legitimate platforming in this game. You're faced with tough jumps pretty regularly, so poor movement controls would have nailed this game dead. Just like Tak's journey through the Great Juju challenge on GBA, he's joined by Locke for this race. Switching to him is activated via the touchscreen, which you'll be doing regularly as much of the gameplay here is focused on moving forward by using each character's unique strengths. For example, Tak can safely navigate watery areas, while Locke has the ability to climb up vines. Hardly an intricate system, but it works for what it is. Something that is a bit of a pain in the ass though is the camera. Many of the 3D platformers this game is emulating had major struggles with this, and Outrun almost gets it right. You can move the camera left and right via the L and R buttons, and this feels spot on. The problems come via the height. The game is always putting the camera into the worst positions. You can control the height of the camera, but this is done via the touchscreen. On an actual Nintendo DS, I could see this working okay. However, it completely eliminates the ability to jump or attack while moving the camera around because your right hand is going to be using the stylus. A lot of the scenarios where you want to adjust the camera involve platforming or fighting, so this isn't exactly a perfect fit. Emulating it on PC is even more cumbersome. Technically speaking, for a DS game, I was pretty blown away by these platforming sections. I think it looks pretty good, actually great if you upres the textures to 1080, and the scale of levels here is a little mind-blowing for the DS. They don't feel quite as sprawling as Tak 1 or 2 on home consoles, but it's not like they were off-puttingly smaller either. I can't think of many 3D games on the DS that used a similar style to this, other than the Mario 64 remake. Seeing Outrun do this makes me wonder why there weren't more 3D platformers for this era of handheld. It's all the more important when you consider this was Outrun's first DS game, and I think it was their first dabble in 3D apart from a couple of arena fighters on the PS1. It's very much a look at what the Tak franchise would have been if it was released on the PS1, and that brings with it some stiffness. Combat can be pretty stiff, particularly with Locke, who is quite frankly not fun to use at all. Tak feels significantly better to control, which exposes a bit of a hole in this game's upgrade system. When you defeat enemies, the specific character you're controlling earns points, which go towards earning new upgrade slots. You could evenly split these between Tak and Locke, but there's no real point. It's not like certain enemies require one specific character to take down, so there's no reason to not just focus on a single character. Doing this then makes the combat laughably easy. It's a bit of an oversight. There's a few other areas that feel undercooked too. The fact that these levels are timed and you earn a score, despite them having no real impact on anything, left me scratching my head. But then again, Outrun came up with a boss battle that doesn't absolutely suck, which more than makes up for those relatively minor issues. These 3D platforming sections are honestly some of the best in the Tak franchise, which makes it hurt so much more when they're disrupted. Minigames, the absolute bane of my existence, even more so than boss battles these days. There are so many of these. Outrun tries to cram in a minigame for every possible use of the DS's gimmicks. You'll be tapping, flicking, and of course blowing into the damn microphone every single time you're interrupted by one of these. I need to reiterate once again that the opening level is completely ruined by these. You're just spammed with them constantly. But then the rest of the game is way more reasonable. The games don't really improve in quality, except for the alligator riding one, which is procedurally generated and impressively smooth, but having them spaced out is a godsend. They're also a massive hurdle if you're going to attempt to play this game in 2022. On original hardware, sure, not a problem. Emulating these minigames, yeah, you're going to have a rough time. Some of the actions you need to perform via the touchscreen are pretty difficult to do via mouse, and I wouldn't blame somebody for not sticking with this game because of it. Maybe I was expecting a little too much, but after seeing the 3D environments, I was hoping for cutscenes here. Instead, the game's story is 95% told via static images. There are a few cutscenes peppered throughout, but it would have been nice to have them here for as many cutscenes as realistically possible. Obviously, some of the story moments would be a little too much for the DS to handle. Also, the soundtrack is horrendous. Altron loves to get a 5-second riff and then loop it to death. Not a pleasant audio experience. The Great Juju challenge is a weird one, and I completely understand why it received a 6.6 average review score. Even with some of the flaws of the 3D platforming gameplay, this would have been a great game if Altron hadn't been seduced by the touchscreen. I'd argue this would be in contention for the best TAC 3D game without the minigames. And it's because of that I would recommend this game to you. You just need to be prepared to grit your teeth through some truly awful minigames to get to the parts that truly shine. It feels like we're slowly building in quality here. I hope that means Avalanche knocked it out of the park with their final game in the trilogy.
Oh, I can't go on no more. Bye-bye, sweet world. Hey-ya!
In most cases, the entire point of doing a handheld version of a bigger budget home console game is to take ideas and gameplay of a grander scope and make it fit on a more restricted platform. Sometimes you'll see handheld games that just run off and do their own thing, but here WayForward and Altron were clearly trying to maintain the original vision from Avalanche. What exactly is that original vision though? Well, here, TAC the Great Juju challenge goes all in on the race and competition aspects. The gameplay is mostly focused on 3D puzzle platforming levels with a timer counting down. TAC and Locke have to reach the exit in the quickest time possible, with your score depending on the time left, items collected, and the amount of enemies defeated. The DS version we just looked at comes quite close to this, but doesn't really go all in on the race format. Reading the developer diaries Avalanche Software produced for IGN at the time, it's clear that the studio really wanted to shake things up with this third version. Every level here is basically a speedrun. A clock is continuously ticking down towards 0 from the moment you enter a level, with various checkpoints adding chunks of time back on. I can't imagine any adult players would run out of time in these levels, but it's a relief to see the time and scores actually having a purpose here. There's a sort of home base or overworld section in the Great Juju challenge which displays a scoreboard. Depending on your performance, you move up or down. But then they sort of shoot themselves in the foot, because the only way you can get knocked out of this challenge is by coming last in the Proving Ground segments, but I'll touch on that a bit later. Co-op is the major focus in the Great Juju challenge, and quite frankly, it's impressive. Avalanche uses a drop-in, drop-out system here, meaning you can make the game single player or co-op at literally any point in time. There were certainly other games from this generation using this kind of system, but it wasn't frequently seen for games designed with more than one player in mind. On a technical level, I'm really impressed. Rather than having one character on screen at a time, both TAC and Locke are running around here fighting enemies and, more importantly, solving puzzles. Playing in single player, you've got a basic stay or follow command, and I found that overall the teammate AI was quite solid. This is largely because the co-op elements are so basic. Pretty much the only thing you'll be doing in this game that requires Tak and Locke to interact with each other is when Locke throws Tak onto a high ledge. Unfortunately, games like this can have near perfect AI, but as soon as it fucks up more than a few times, that's all you're going to remember. There were numerous times where my partner would yeet themselves off into a bottomless pit, or stand around like a statue, leaving me to fight all the enemies by myself. Whether it was caused by my fat fingers or the actual game itself, the Great Juju challenge has a habit of the stay command randomly turning on. As you can imagine, this results in frustrating scenarios where you're thinking, wait a minute, where the hell is Locke? Only to discover he's back at the start of the level. It's frustrating just enough to the point where I wish this was a purely single player experience. The actual interactions between Tak and Locke are so minimal that it could easily work as a solo game. The co-op nature also creates a lot of weird quirks with the gameplay. When you die, both characters respawn at the last checkpoint together. This causes moments where instead of clearing a traversal puzzle the intended way, you can just burst ahead with one character, jump to your death, and then you have the other character join you. But then on the flip side of that, you'll rip your hair out when you finally got both characters in the correct location to solve a puzzle, then you take a hit and die with one of the characters, only to have both characters respawn at the checkpoint. This isn't an issue present in 2-player, so Avalanche have actually made the single-player experience more cumbersome in favour of the co-op.
Let the challenge begin!
The arsenal at Tak and Locke's disposal here is very similar to the DS. Just like the DS, Tak's combat is far more enjoyable. He's got a sword for melee attacks and then a ranged attack that makes him such a great all-round option. In comparison, Locke has a gigantic mallet that is cumbersome to use. The deeper you get into the game, the more combo moves you unlock, and they allow for things like better crowd control in a fight. But none of this is ever really that necessary because the combat is absurdly easy. Enemies are mostly a minor nuisance that you dispatch without a thought, and that might be the intention of Avalanche. After all, this is a race, so putting small things to take your attention away from completing the level fast kind of makes sense. But the combat happens so frequently that it just becomes dull to participate in, even more so once you reach the point of the game where a Juju upgrades your combat. Tak starts dual-wielding swords like he's auditioning to take Leo's spot in Nickelodeon All-Star Brawl, and you just absolutely melt enemies with these. On top of frequent scripted upgrades, the game also features the Blessing Gem upgrade system too. You'll purchase these to beef up your health, power and mana, but you run into the same issues the DS game had. You're never really forced to use Tak or Locke specifically for combat, so there's no reason not to dump everything into the character you prefer. I also never felt like the upgrades were making a noticeable difference here. The Great Juju Challenge's platformer gameplay is a bit of a mixed bag, but it makes its most costly mistake with the movement. I have no idea what Avalanche did to Tak's physics for this game, but he's so damn slippery, to the point where it feels like this game is being played on ice sometimes. There was nothing really wrong with how the previous two entries controlled, so I'm at a loss as to why they'd even attempt to change this, let alone make it significantly worse. Jumping around feels so floaty, and I never felt in control of Tak when making jumps. It's kind of embarrassing to say that the DS port controls much better. And in general, the gameplay for the PS2, GameCube and Xbox version just feels off. It all comes back to the game being built around trying to finish the levels as fast as possible. This sort of strips the essence from the game. You spend 100% of the time trying to do everything as fast as humanly possible. Gotta kill these enemies instantly, have to blow through this puzzle right away. The Great Juju Challenge never wants you to slow down, and I don't know, I walked away from the experience feeling like it was incredibly hollow.
Some strange things happened to the other competitors. We thought the Black Mist might have been involved.
Well, we don't have to worry about the Black Mist anymore.
Once you speed through the platforming like you're fucking Sonic the Hedgehog, you arrive at the Proving Ground. After the GBA and DS ports both had vehicle sections that were races, you might be interested to see that the Proving Ground isn't even remotely a race. Instead, you're playing Destruction Derby, but without the banger soundtrack from the PS1 game. This is where the scores come into play. There are 4 different vehicles to choose from in these sections, one that inflicts a lot of damage, one that is really quick, one that has great armor, and then there's an all-rounder car. Depending on where you stand on the leaderboard, that's what order you will be picking your car in. First gets to call dibs on whatever car they want, while last place is left with the crumbs. Then you're plonked into an arena and you all battle it out to see who can cause the most damage. Whoever finishes last is kicked out of the Great Juju challenge. Bizarrely, I think this whole segment would have worked better as a race. I'm imagining something where you get a head start based on where you are on the leaderboard, with last place being at a real disadvantage. As it stands, picking your vehicle is pretty much irrelevant to your performance, at least in my experience. It just makes the scores feel pointless again. Also, these sections are way too long and are completely rigged. The story, at least for the first couple of Proving Ground sections, is that the Black Mist team sucks, but they managed to cheat their way into staying in the competition despite finishing last. So basically, you have to be a brain dead moron to lose here, which again makes the Proving Ground feel pointless. I'm not sure if it was the dump truck full of money that Disney gave them, but damn, Avalanche went all out for the cutscenes here. There's almost 40 minutes worth of pre-rendered cutscenes in this game, which I would guess is more than the first 2 games combined. TAC 1 and 2 often supplemented those high-quality, big-budget cutscenes with in-engine, lower-budget cutscenes, but in this case, Avalanche just went all in. And that's actually a damn shame, because the story here is the worst out of the 3 games. Again, it comes back to the silly race gimmick. You just start off doing this competition for no real reason. There isn't any motivation. Then eventually you find out that the Black Mist is cheating. But wait, who even are the Black Mist? It's hard to care about them cheating when you're never really introduced to them or even get to interact with them. It's an utterly boring story, and while the signature TAC humor is on display here, I can't help but feel like this was a missed opportunity. So many cutscenes, but so little story. The game's levels and character models look gorgeous when upscaled to 1080p, but a lot of the levels felt like remixes of concepts and levels already present in the TAC series. Levels like Gates of Nocturne and Fowler's Murk just feel way too similar to levels you've already experienced. It gives the game a bit of a budget feeling. Considering Avalanche was making roughly 1 billion games at the same time, maybe this was a casualty caused by the insane amount of work they were putting out. They didn't skimp on the soundtrack though, that has some real bangers. Gates of Nocturne is a real standout. TAC the Great Juju challenge is like a 6 out of 10 to me. It's not awful and it shines in a lot of areas, but that shine is massively dulled by its poor qualities. The co-op is impressive on a technical level, but it also hurts the single player experience and there's not a whole lot of interaction between the 2 players. The race concept is unique, but kind of makes levels feel like they lack depth, and the whole point of a leaderboard kind of goes out the window with the Proving Ground. You've got these beautiful cutscenes, but then no interesting story to speak of. It's a running theme throughout the Great Juju challenge and the TAC franchise as a whole. TAC is the most 6 out of 10 franchise I've ever seen. After revisiting them in this day and age, I fully understand why the series never truly took off. To me, the biggest issue with the TAC franchise is that Avalanche never actually nailed what this franchise should be. The first game had this sort of semi-open nature to everything, which was then replaced by a completely linear experience, which was then replaced by this race gimmick. The only real consistent thing about the gameplay in this series is like the connection with animals, but even that is sort of non-existent in this third game. It all feels disjointed. All 3 games in this trilogy feel completely separate from one another. They don't feel like sequels that are building upon foundations. It's like they went into each subsequent game and acted like they were starting from scratch, which is especially baffling because they were pushing these games out on a yearly basis. One would imagine that they'd want to iterate on what they'd already built. I wish I loved the Tak trilogy, but I just don't. Next time on Nickelodeon Video Game History, I'll be reviewing a game from a lost Nickelodeon franchise. Evergirl is something so obscure that you can barely find evidence these days that it existed. This was Nickelodeon and Viacom's attempt at appealing to girls through a lifestyle brand, which somehow expanded into the gaming space with a GBA title. To make sure you don't miss any of my upcoming reviews, including the impending Nicktoons Unite review, go ahead and hit that subscribe button. And to stay up to date with everything that's happening with the channel, jump over to Twitter and give me a follow.